The alien princess hated humans until one won her heart on the battlefield. The first thing she said to me was, "Move your unit to the eastern ridge and hold it." She did not say, "Please." She did not look at me when she said it. She was already studying a holographic map that floated above her wrist panel, her long fingers tracing troop positions. Like she was arranging furniture, around her stood 6 Valoran officers in white armor, polished so clean it hurt to look at. Directly around me stood 11 humans in mismatched gear, held together with field tape and stubbornness. My name is Corporal Kai Brennan. I am 26 years old, 5'11" in tall, and on that morning I weighed 173 lb. I say this because when Commander Antelsura of the Valoran Empire finally did glance at me, she looked like someone who had just been handed a dull tool they did not want and were being forced to use. Anyway, I had been briefed on the Valoran before deployment. Everyone in the human coalition forces gets the same lecture. The Valian are the oldest space-faring civilization in the known cluster. They have been flying between stars for 11,000 years. They build cities on the surfaces of dead moons and grow food in the vacuum of space using technology that our best engineers still cannot fully explain. They're tall, pale-skinned, silver-haired, and they move with a kind of quiet precision that makes you feel clumsy just by watching them. Their empire spans 42 star systems. They have fought and won wars that lasted longer than recorded human history. Humans had been in space for 60 years. You can imagine how they felt about us. The coalition was a joint military operation between 5 species against the Krath Dominion, which had been raiding mining outposts along the outer belt for 2 years. The Kraraft were vicious, fast, and organized in a way that simple words make hard to explain. They did not fight like any army a human strategist had read about. They moved in rolling waves, broke apart, reformed, hit from directions that made no tactical sense until suddenly they made all the sense in the world. And half your line was gone. The Valoran had fought them before. The Surin had fought them before. The Drev had fought them. Humans had not. We were the new members of the coalition, the ones who had barely qualified to be here, the ones every other species treated like a child who had wandered into a room where they adults were talking. I had accepted that. Most of us had. You learn quickly that resentment takes energy you need for other things, but Commander An was something else. She was not rude in the way that careless people are rude. She was precise about it, deliberate. When she addressed our platoon for the first time in the joint briefing room of the forward base, she did it the way someone might address a tool they have been required to use despite preferring another one. She called us the human contingent, the way someone says the heavy luggage. When our platoon's combat record was brought up by one of the Surin coordinators, she glanced at it for approximately 2 seconds and then said, "Limited engagement history." Noted 2 words like we were a footnote. Sergeant Dirk Hole, who had been standing beside me during the briefing, leaned close and whispered, "I've been dismissed by experts, but she might be the best I've ever seen." I did not laugh, but I felt the corner of my mouth move. The eastern ridge was a bad position. Anyone who looked at the terrain map for more than 30 seconds could see that it was elevated, which sounded good, but it was also exposed on 3 sides. The ground below it was loose shale that would channel movement, noise directly up to any defender, and the only natural cover was a line of graystone outcroppings that a single grenade could clear if the craft hit. The ridge in numbers, the unit holding. It would have no real retreat path. It was the kind of position you gave to a unit you expected to lose. I knew this. Every soldier in my platoon knew this. I saw it in their faces when I relayed the assignment. Dirk Cole's jaw tightened for just a moment before she smoothed it out. Private Owen Hatch, who was the youngest of us at 19 and who had a habit of chewing on the strap of his helmet when he was nervous, started chewing. Private Nora Finn looked at the terrain data on her wrist unit and then looked at me with the flat, calm expression. That meant she had already run the numbers and did not like what they told her. I looked back at her and nodded. Once I know, we go anyway. We moved to the ridge at 300 and began setting up defensive positions in the dark without lights, without noise. We dug shallow holes in the shale with our hands where the tools made too much sound. Organized the firing lanes without being asked. Owen and Nora rigged a simple vibration alarm from spare parts in their packs that would give us a few extra seconds of warning if something heavy moved toward us from below. A soldier named Len Marsh, who before the war had been a plumber in a small town in northern England, figured out that the outcropping stones could be wedged and stacked into a much better barrier than they appeared at first look. He spent an hour doing it quietly and by himself, and when he was done, the position was genuinely stronger. Nobody ordered Len to do that, he just did it. Because the position needed doing, I sat on the highest point of the ridge at 4:30 and looked out at the dark landscape below. The craft were out there somewhere. The main coalition force was positioned 2 km back in a reinforced ground installation. Commander Antelsra was there in her clean white armor, studying her maps with her precise fingers. I thought about the way she had looked at me, not with hostility exactly, with indifference, like she had already calculated our value and the number had not impressed her. I thought about that for a while, then I stopped thinking about it because Nora's vibration alarm went off at A4:47 and the night below us started moving. The attack came from 2 directions at once, which was the first sign that this was not a patrol. Patrols come from one direction. What came at us from below the ridge came from the south and the east simultaneously, which meant they had split in the dark, which meant they had planned this, which meant someone had fed them the positioning of our forces in advance, or they had scouts we had not detected. I did not have time to think about that. I had time to say, hold positions, let them commit, and then I had time to shoot. The Krath are not large creatures. They are roughly the height of a human child, wide in the shoulders with 4 limbs. They can use for either running or climbing, depending on what the terrain demands. Their skin is dark gray-green and absorbs light in a way that makes them genuinely difficult to see at night. Without thermal enhancement, what they lack in size, they make up for in speed. And in the strange, unsettling way they communicate during a fight, which is not through sound but through a series of body movements that allow an entire unit to shift tactics simultaneously without a single word spoken. In the first 90 seconds, we fired 300 rounds and took 2 casualties. Owen Hatch took a strike to the shoulder that spun him off his feet and put him down hard. A soldier named Pete Graves, took a more serious wound to his left side and had to pull back from the line. I heard Pete swear once loudly and then stopped swearing and start breathing carefully, which was worse to hear than the swearing. Hatch is mobile, Dara said from 6M to my left. She had assessed Owen without stopping firing, which was the kind of thing Dara Cole could do and most people could not. Graves needs pressure. He can still hold the position on it, said a voice at the back. That was Ellie Var, our medic, 22 years old and the calmest person I had ever met in a crisis, moving to Pete without being told. The next wave hit before I had finished processing the first. More of them this time, coming faster, having learned from the first push where our firing positions were. They adjusted their approach angle in real time, which was the thing about the craft that the briefing materials described as tactically adaptive, and which in practice meant they were terrifying. Standard enemy hits your position, takes losses, retreats, reorganizes. The craft did not retreat. They absorbed the shape of your resistance and then float around it like water, finding a new path. Len Marsh's stone barrier saved us from the third wave. They came up the shale slope below us, expecting to reach the outcropping line quickly, and instead hit the stacked barrier 3M earlier than their approach angle had accounted for. It disrupted their timing. It gave us 4 seconds of clean target opportunity that we did not waste. I counted 11 humans on a badly placed ridge holding against a force I estimated at between 60 and 80 craft for 22 minutes. It was not elegant. It was not clean. My hands were shaking in a way they did sometimes in the middle of a sustained fight, a physical fact that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with adrenaline management. In cold air, Nora Fenn had taken a hit to her forearm, strapped it against her body, and was firing one-handed without dropping her accuracy below acceptable. Dra was directing fire and movement across the ridge simultaneously, while also I noticed at one point physically hauling a dazed Owen Hatch back into a safer position by the collar. Then the main coalition force came under fire. The radio crackled at 514, and the voice that came through belonged to a Valoran signals officer, and it was not calm. The forward installation was being hit from the north. What had happened to us on the ridge was not the main attack. It was the distraction. The craft had used us as a way to pull attention away from the real target in the installation. Commander Antelsera was directing a defense with 60% of her available forces already committed to the southern perimeter. The northern approach was thin. Her personal command post was in the northern section. I looked at my platoon. Pete Graves was down. Owen Hatch was mobile but slow. Every one of us had been fighting for 22 minutes against a force that should have overwhelmed us. The ridge was technically still holding. I keyed the radio and said, Brennan, platoon is moving to the installation, northern approach. The Valiant signals officer said, you have no authorization to leave your position. I said, noted. Then I signaled Dara Cole, and she started moving the platoon off the ridge at a run. We came through the northern perimeter at 5:31 in a state that I think surprised the Valoran soldiers defending it, because they had clearly expected the humans on the eastern ridge to still be on the eastern ridge. We were dirty, breathing hard, 2 soldiers short of full strength, and we came in running rather than walking. which I think was the detail that made the Valorin nearest the gap actually step back. There was no time for anyone to explain anything. The craft were already inside the northern perimeter, not in large numbers, but in precisely the numbers needed to create chaos in a command post, which is to say a small number in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. The right place was a corridor 3M from where Commander Avantelsa was standing. I did not have a plan that was more sophisticated than reach the corridor before the craft do. That was the plan. It was not a subtle plan. It did not require a briefing or a holographic map with troop positions arranged like furniture. I reached the corridor first. There was a moment which I remember with a strange and specific clarity where I was running and I could see two craft ahead of me, and I could also see her, the commander, standing with her sidearm drawn and three of her personal guard already down around her. She was not panicking, she was not running, she was standing in the stance of someone who has decided to fight where they are and has accepted what that decision means. That image stayed in my mind for a long time afterward. She was alone and she was not going to run, and the only thing between the two craft and 3M of corridor separating them from her was me. In about 1 second of available time, I covered the distance. I will not describe the next 40 seconds in detail. I will say that it was close and loud, and that I took a hit across my upper left arm that I did not register as pain until long afterward, because pain has an appointment system and it does not always show up during the meeting. I will say that Darkhold came in behind me and handled the second contact with the kind of controlled, practiced movement that always made her terrifying to watch in close quarters. And I will say that when it was over, the corridor was clear, and I was standing in front of Commander Antelsora with blood on my left sleeve and dust on my face, and the specific unsteadiness in my knees that comes after your body has spent all its emergency chemicals and is waiting for the invoice. She looked at me. I do not have words good enough for that look. It was not gratitude. Gratitude is soft and warm, and she was not a soft or warm person. It was something else, something more like recalculation, like a math problem she had already solved, coming back with a different answer. Her silver hair was out of its braid. There was a mark on her jaw from where she had apparently been hit by something. She was breathing harder than I had ever seen her breathe. She said, "Your unit should be on the eastern ridge." I said, "The ridge is clear. We moved when the installation came under attack." She said, "You had no orders to move." I said, "No." There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds around us. The installation was still noisy with the end of a fight with valiant soldiers pushing the remaining craft back through the perimeter with the radio traffic of a dozen people trying to understand what had just happened and where everything was. She said, "You should have your arm treated." I looked down at my left arm. The sleeve was torn and dark. I had not really looked at it until she said that. I said, "Yes, I will." She turned away. First, she walked back toward the command post with her sidearm still in her hand and her unbraided silver hair still loose, and she did not look back. Darkhold appeared beside me and said quietly, "I counted 4 craft between us and the perimeter, not 2. I said, "I know I miscounted in the dark." She said, "Good thing you ran anyway." I did not have anything to say to that, so I went to find Elivar and get my arm treated. The after-action report was filed by 800. I did not read it. I was asleep by 7:30 in a bunk that was 2 sizes too short for me in a barracks. That smelled like recycled air and cold metal. I slept for 6 hours without dreaming, which was the best sleep I had since deployment. 3 days later, Private Owen Hatch showed me the coalition's updated unit classification log on his data pad. He pointed to the line for the human platoon attached to the joint operation. The word expendable had been removed from our unit classification. Nobody announced this. Nobody explained it. It was just gone. Owen looked at me like he expected me to say something significant. I looked at the blank space where the word had been and thought about silver hair loose from a braid and a 3-second pause in a corridor. I handed his data pad back and said, "Get some sleep, Owen," he said. "Do you think she changed it?" I said, "Get some sleep." He did not look convinced, but he went. I stood there for another minute in the narrow corridor of the barracks, alone, looking at nothing in particular. Outside, the sky of this planet was a deep amber color at dusk, which was something I had not noticed before that moment. It was strange and beautiful and completely indifferent to all of us, which I found oddly comforting. I went to sleep thinking about a math problem, coming back with a different answer. I did not know yet that the different answer was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the battle at the northern perimeter, Commander on Telsura requested my platoon for a reconnaissance mission into the outer relay zone. She did not come to us directly. The request came through the Coalition Coordination Channel, formatted as a standard tactical assignment, worded in the same flat official language used for any routine deployment. If you read it quickly, it looked like nothing. If you read it carefully, which I did twice, sitting at the small steel table in the platoon briefing room with a cup of something that the vending unit optimistically called coffee, you noticed that the assignment was voluntary, technically optional. The request used the word request, where assignment orders normally use the word assigned. Dara Cole read it over my shoulder and said she asked for us. Specifically, I said she asked for a human unit with Eastern Ridge experience. Dara said, "That's us." I said, "That's us." There was a silence. Then Dar said, "You're going to say yes." I said, "We're going to say yes." She made a small sound that might have been approval and might have been amusement and walked out of the briefing room to start telling the platoon to gear up. We met the commander and her accompanying team at the forward staging point at 60. She was standing with 2 Valoran officers and a Surin scout specialist named Varric, who I had worked alongside briefly during the first week of deployment and who I respected for his ability to read terrain the way people read text. When we arrived on, looked at us with that same calm, measuring expression she used for everything and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Sergeant Brennan." She had not used my rank before. She had used the collective, the human contingent, or a gesture toward the group, or simply nothing, relying on the context of briefings to make clear she was addressing us. The use of my specific rank and name did something small and particular to the air in that moment, the way a single instrument entering a song changes the whole character of it without anyone being able to say exactly how. I said, "Commander." She turned back to the mission map and the briefing began. The relay zone was a communications dead Spot created by the terrain, a long valley carved between two ridges of iron. Heavy rock that disrupted most standard signal transmissions. The craft had been using it, the intelligence team believed, to move supply convoys without being tracked. The mission was to position observation sensors at 4 specific points along the valley edges, gather 12 hours of movement data, and extract without contact, clean, quiet. No engagement if at all possible. She walked us through the plan with the precise economical language she used for everything. No wasted words, no repeated points, no questions invited until she had finished. When she was done, she looked up from the map and said, "Questions?" It was not phrased as a question itself. It was more like a permission issued and then immediately monitored. Nora Finn, who had healed enough to rejoin full duty with her arm in a partial support brace, raised one hand and said, "The third observation point puts us on open ground for approximately 40 m. If we encounter a craft patrol, the extraction route goes back through the open section before we can reach any cover." An looked at her. Not the dismissive look from the first briefing, something more attentive. She said, "Correct, the route takes that risk to maintain sensor accuracy at the third point. The data collected there covers the primary passage mouth." She paused. "Your suggestion," Nora said, "stay extraction equipment at the nearest cover point before we move to position 3. It adds 8 minutes but removes the open ground problem on the way back." There was a brief silence. An said, "Agreed." She turned to her Valoran officer and said something in their language, and the officer updated the tactical overlay. Nora glanced at me. I did not react, but I noted it. We moved out at 700 road in 2 staggered groups, the Valoran forward, our platoon covering the left flank and managing the sensor deployment equipment. The valley was cold. The iron rock on the ridge faces was a deep rust color in the morning light, textured like old bark, and it absorbed sound in a way that made the whole landscape feel muffled. Even the wind was quiet here. It was the kind of place where you became aware of your own breathing. We placed the first sensor without incident. The second sensor took longer because the designated position was on a narrow ledge that required 2 soldiers to hold the equipment steady while a third secured it to the rock face. Dara and Len Marsh handled it with the wordless efficiency they had developed from weeks of working alongside each other. On watch from a position 6 m back, and I saw her tracking the process with that attentive expression, the one I had started to distinguish from her default calm. At the third position we deploy Nora's modification without discussion. Pre-staged, efficient, 8 minutes well spent. The fourth position was at the far end of the valley and required a full 2 hours of travel across difficult ground to reach. By the time we placed the final sensor and confirmed the network was broadcasting, it was my afternoon, and the sky above the valley had shifted from pale amber to a deeper, almost copper tone. An signaled to hold for position assessment before extraction. Standard procedure. We spread to defensible points and waited while she and Varric reviewed the sensor data on a portable display. I found myself approximately 4 meters from her. During the hold, both of us positioned against the same rust-colored rock face. Not by any plan, simply by the way the terrain had organized the group. She was looking at the display and I was watching the valley below, and neither of I said anything for several minutes. Then she said without looking up from the display, "Your medic var," she treated 4 craft prisoners after the installation engagement. It was not a question, but it was not a statement either. It was something in between. The kind of sentence that is shaped like information but functions like a probe. I said yes. She said why? I said because they were wounded. She was quiet for a moment, then she said they were the enemy. I said they were wounded. Ellie treats wounded people. That's her job. She doesn't sort first. An looked up from the display, then not at me directly but slightly away from me, in the direction of the valley, as though she was looking at a point in the middle distance where some answer might be found if she looked carefully enough. She said, "We do not do that." I said, "I know." She said, "It is considered a tactical liability, allocating medical resources to enemy combatants." I said, "Ellie doesn't think of it that way. None of us do." Really looked at me, then the copper light of the afternoon came over the ridge edge and touched the side of her face, which was angular and precise in the way that Valoran faces were structured, like something carved rather than grown. But in that light it was just a face, a thinking face, a face trying to work something out. She said, "Explain it." I said, "It's hard to explain. It's not a calculation. It's more like a reflex. You see someone who needs help. You help them. The category of who they are comes second to the fact that they're in front of you and hurting." She considered this for a long moment. Then she said, "That is not efficient." I said, "No, it's really not." She almost smiled. "I want to be careful about that, because I am not certain." The corner of her mouth changed. It was small and it vanished quickly, and she looked back at her display before I could be sure I had seen it, but I think it was almost a smile. We extracted from the valley at 1700 without contact. The sensor network performed perfectly. The 12 hours of data it collected over the following period provided the coalition with movement intelligence that directly resulted in the interception of 3 craft supply routes and a significant operational setback for the Dominion. In the debrief, AAN cited the 8-minute modification to the extraction plan as a contributing factor to mission success. She attributed it to the human unit's field assessment capability. She did not say Nora's name, but she had remembered the suggestion and she had included it in the official record. That night, Owen Hatch, who had a habit of noticing things and then saying them out loud without fully thinking through whether he should, said to me over dinner, "The commander keeps watching you." I said, "She watches everything." He said, "She watches other things differently than she watches you." I said, "Owen," he said, "I'm just saying." I said, "Eat your food." He ate his food, but he looked like someone who had said what he meant to say and was content with how it had landed. I did not sleep as easily that night, not for a bad reason, more the way you sometimes cannot sleep when something has shifted, when the world has moved a small degree to the left or right without anything dramatic happening, and you lie awake wondering whether you measure the shift correctly or whether you are making something out of nothing. I had spent 6 weeks being invisible to her, being furniture, being the human contingent, the ballistic meet, the unit with limited engagement history. Now she was asking me to explain things. I was not sure what to do with that. I was not sure what it meant or where it led or whether it was anything beyond a very smart officer updating her models with new information. The Valian were analytical They processed data and revised. Conclusions, that was probably all this was. I told myself that several times in the dark of the barracks. Then the coalition command sent a new directive. Down through channels and things became considerably more complicated. The directive came from Valoran High Command, not from the coalition leadership, and it was transmitted specifically to Commander on Telsora, rather than to the Joint Operations Board. I would not have known about it at all, except that its effects became visible within 24 hours in the way our unit was being handled. We were removed from the primary operation schedule, not discharged, not sent home, simply pulled from the forward deployment list and reassigned to support and logistical functions, which is the kind of language that sounds administrative and is actually designed to make a unit disappear from significance without anyone being required to explain why. The message was clear to anyone who understood how coalition politics worked. The human unit was becoming too visible, too present in the forward operational record. The Valoran High Command wanted that corrected. I found out about the directive from Varric, the Surin scout, who told me one morning, with the blunt directness that was characteristic of the Surin, and which I had come to appreciate deeply. He said, "Your unit has been flagged for repositioning. Lin Central does not want humans in primary operations." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because I was at the installation when you came through the northern perimeter. I believe you have a right to know what is being done." I thanked him. He nodded once and walked away. I said, with that information for the rest of the morning, I did not tell my platoon. Not yet. I wanted to understand at first what it meant, what could be done about it, and whether there was anything to do at all. The reassignment orders came through official channels at 1400. Support and logistical functions. Effective immediately, no explanation given. I was walking to the platoon quarters to deliver the news when I passed a corridor junction and found Commander on Telsora standing there, alone, looking at a data screen, not in the way someone looks at something they are reading, but in the way someone looks at something they are arguing with. She looked up when she heard me. Neither of us moved for a moment. I said, "We've been reassigned," she said. "I am aware." I said, "Logistical support," she said. "Is that your decision?" She held my gaze for exactly long enough that the answer became clear. Before she spoke it, she said no. I said, "Understood." She looked back at her screen. I walked on. I told the platoon at 1600. Darl said nothing. She sat very still for approximately 10 seconds and then stood up and started reorganizing her equipment with the focused, methodical energy she used when she needed to process something without saying it out loud. Owen Hatch looked at the floor. Nora Fenn said, "Logistical support," in a tone that made those two words carry the weight of something much heavier. Len Marsh, who was sitting on a crate near the back of the room with his boots off, said simply, "Right," and then he started pulling his boots back on. That was it. No one complained, no one argued. They just started getting ready to do whatever came next, whatever form it took, in whatever category they had been put. I had served with these people for 8 months. I thought not for the first time that they were the most impressive human beings I had ever met. Not because of what they could do in a fight, because of what they were made of. In the quiet moments, in the moments when the answer was unfair and the Choice was to accept it and keep going. That evening, the reassignment orders were quietly suspended, no announcement, no explanation. The orders sat in pending status in the system, which meant they had been submitted but not finalized, which meant someone with the authority to pause them had paused them. The next morning we were placed back on the primary operation schedule. I did not ask how, I did not ask who. I saw Commander Antel Sara in the briefing corridor at 700, and she walked past me without slowing and said in a voice flat and even and professional rain, "Assessment of the Northern Pass 8. Hendro, your unit is assigned." I said, "Yes, Commander." She kept walking, beside me, said nothing. But I felt her look at me and then look away, the way someone does when they are very carefully not saying what they are thinking. That night I sat outside on a supply crate in the cold amber dark of the base perimeter and thought about this. I thought about the suspended orders. I thought about the data screen she had been arguing within the corridor. I thought about the way she had said no when I asked if the reassignment was her decision, and what it had taken for a Valoran commander to say that word to human corporal in a corridor. The Valoran do not explain themselves, they do not justify, they do not show the work. She had shown me exactly enough to let me understand. I did not know what to call what was happening. I had no framework for it. I was a human corporal from a species that had been in space for 60 years, and she was a Valoran princess from an empire 11,000 years old, and whatever was building between us was not something anyone had a map for, but I had learned a long time ago that the absence of a map does not mean the territory does not exist. I went inside. I slept. In the morning we went to work. Intelligence failure happened on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because Owen Hatch had written it in the small logbook kept in the left breast pocket of his jacket, the one where he wrote down dates and brief notes about things that seemed important at the time. He showed it to me later. Entry read, Thursday she went north. We didn't know it was as accurate as anything else I could say about that day. Commander Antelsera had gone north with a 2-person reconnaissance team to verify a piece of intelligence suggesting that the craft had established a forward observation post in the hills above the valley where we had placed the sensor network 6 weeks earlier. The intelligence came from a Surin analyst, was passed through 3 layers of coalition review, and was assessed as reliable. It was not reliable. What was waiting in the hills above the valley was not a forward observation post. It was a full craft tactical unit, 40 strong, positioned there deliberately, and the intelligence suggesting a small observation post had been fabricated to draw exactly the kind of small, fast reconnaissance mission that An had sent north. She walked into a trap. Her Tourison team was separated. Almost immediately, the craft moved fast and used the terrain perfectly. By 1100, she was alone in the upper section of the valley 4 kilometers north of the forward base, in a landscape of rust-cold rock and deep shadow where 40 enemies knew exactly where she was, and she had approximately 11 rounds remaining and no extraction route that did not run through the force that had boxed her in. We knew none of this at 1100. We were on standard schedule, running equipment checks, going through the quiet routine of a mid-morning at a forward base. The first signal that something was wrong came at 11:37 when Varric found me Equipment bay, and said without preamble, "The commander has not checked in. Her beacon is static. Her team is down." I said, "Where is she?" He showed me on his wrist map, Northern Valley Upper Section. What units are available for extraction? He said, "The main force is committed on the southern defensive line. Following an escalation this morning, the Valiant Rapid Response Team is pinned 2 km east of the second ridge. There is no authorized unit available for northern extraction." I looked at the map. For about 4 seconds, I said, "My platoon is available." Varric said, "Your platoon is assigned to logistical support. You have no operational clearance for a northern deployment." I said, "Is there any other unit that can reach her position in time?" He looked at the map. He looked at me. He said, "No." I said, "Then we're going." Varric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am coming with you." I said, "I was not going to ask you to do that." He said, "I know I am offering." He paused. "She helped my unit once 3 years ago. A different engagement. I remember what she did." I did not ask what she had done. I nodded. "I went to find my platoon. It took me 2 minutes to find them and 2 minutes to explain the situation." The explanation was short because it had to be. The commander was alone in the northern valley. No other unit could reach her. We had no authorization. We were going anyway. Anyone who did not want to come could say so, and there would be no consequence. Nobody said so. Dara Cole started checking her weapon before I finished the sentence. Len Marsh was already on his feet. Nora Fenn, whose arm braced the medical officer, had said she should keep on for another week, pulled it off and left it on the table, and picked up her rifle. Owens Hatch was chewing his helmet strap with the focused intensity of a person who is nervous and doing something about it. Anyway, Elivar packed her medical kit. In 30 seconds, we moved out at 11:47. The northern path was harder than anything we had covered before. The valley approach was direct, but it was also exposed, and we could not take the direct route without walking into the same terrain that had boxed her in. We went instead along the eastern ridge line above the valley floor, which added 40 minutes to the travel time, but kept us out of the kill zone until we could assess the craft positions. Varric was invaluable. He read the terrain the way I had seen him read it before, quickly and accurately, identifying craft positions from subtle indicators that would have taken me much longer to process. He pointed ahead, indicate movement, held up fingers for numbers, wordless and precise. At 13:19 he held up a fist. Stop. We went flat against the rock below us on the valley floor. 3 craft were moving southward in a loose patrol formation. They were perhaps 30 m below us, moving slowly, not in combat mode, but in the careful searching pattern they used when they were hunting a specific target and expected to find it shortly. We waited. They moved south past our position and continued. We waited until they were out of sight around a rock formation. We moved again. The valley narrowed in the upper section, the walls closing into perhaps 40 m across, the iron rock rising steeply on both sides. It was quieter here, more enclosed in the sounds we had heard below. Movement, a distant signal tone, the particular low noise the craft made when communicating in close quarters were absent. That silence was not reassuring. It was the silence of a space that has been cleared by intention rather than emptiness. Varric touched my arm. He pointed to a position ahead and above us on the right wall of the valley, a narrow ledge maybe 15 m up that overlooked the valley floor. I could not see anyone there, but I trusted Varric. I signaled draw. She studied the ledge for 3 seconds and then made a small motion with her head. Confirmation, she had seen something. 2. We split. Dara took Owen and Len around the base of the right wall, moving to a position below the ledge. I took Nora and Varric further into the valley, moving quickly now, using the remaining cover to push toward where her beacon had last been active. We found her 2 minutes later. She was behind a large rock formation at the very end of the valley in the last defensible position the terrain offered. She was crouched low, her sidearm in her hand, and she was looking in 2 directions, alternately, with the systematic rhythm of someone who has been keeping that exact watch for a long time and has resolved to keep it until they cannot anymore. There were 2 craft between us and her position, circling slowly, and there was at minimum 1 on the ledge above. The 2 on the ground would see us before we could reach her. We could not cross the 20 m open section to her position without being seen. I looked at Varric. He looked at me. Behind us, very faintly, I heard a single controlled sound. That was Dara Cole signaling that she was in position below the ledge. I counted to 3. I cannot even now explain how much happened in the next 2 minutes with any kind of calmness or literary grace. What I can say is that it was loud, it was fast, and it was decided by the same margin that most close-quarter situations are decided by, which is approximately 1 second of someone doing something before the situation changes, and that option closes forever. We crossed the 20 m. Nora handled the left contact. Varric handled the right. Above us, the sound from the ledge went sudden and then stopped, which was Dar. I reached the rock formation. She was on one knee, sidearm level, looking at me for a moment. Neither of us moved. I was breathing hard from the run. She was breathing hard from hours of sustained stress and in an excluse with an enemy who had been methodically tightening the circle around her. Her silver hair was loose again, the braid entirely undone, and there was blood from a cut above her eyebrow that had dried dark against her pale skin, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not calculation, not recalibration, something that did not have a professional category. I said, "Can you move?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Then we move now, quickly." She stood. She put her sidearm in its holster and she moved. No questions asked, no discussion of authorization or orders or the proper protocol for an extraction that did not officially exist. And I turned and she was beside me and we ran. The extraction took 43 minutes. We lost the path twice, and Varric recovered it both times. Owen took a hit to his leg in the final section, shallow, not serious, but enough to slow him, and Len Marsh put his arm around him and carried half his weight without being asked, which was the most Len Marsh thing that had ever happened. Ellie Varr was at the back of the group, and twice I heard her calm, low voice over the channel managing something I did not ask about in the moment. We came through the perimeter at 14:28. We were dirty and we were loud, and we were 11 humans and 1 siren and 1 valiant commander, and we were all breathing like we had been running for a long time, because we had been running for a long time. Medical was waiting. Someone had called ahead. The base was already in a controlled chaos of people, responding to the news that Commander Telsura's team was down and she was missing, and our arrival through the northern gate, present and complete, caused the kind of ripple effect you see when an outcome reverses so suddenly that the people prepared for one result have to stop and replace it entirely with another. Ellie went immediately to Owen. Lynn sat down on the ground and did not move for several minutes. Dra stood with her weapon across her body and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who has finished a calculation and is verifying the result. I was standing just inside the gate. Varric was beside me. Around us people moved and spoke, and the base continued its organized response to a crisis that had just resolved in the last way anyone had expected. On was 3M away. The medical team was around her, checking the cut above her eyebrow, asking questions, and she was answering them with her typical precision, steady and clear, giving them exactly the information they needed in exactly the right order. Then she turned her head and looked at me. She looked at me for a long moment, not with the expression from the first day, not the indifference or the calculation or the recalibration. Something quieter than all of those. Something that looked to me in the amber light of the late afternoon through the perimeter gate, like the expression on a person's face when they have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and someone has just quietly made it possible to let go. She said my name, not Sergeant, not Brennan, not the human contingent or the human unit or any of the categories that had sorted me into places below her. Notice for the first weeks of this deployment, she said, Kai, one word. My name, just that, I said. Commander. She looked at me for another moment. Then she turned back to the medical team and continued answering their questions. I walked to the nearest wall and sat down on the ground with my back against it and my legs out in front of me, and I thought about nothing for approximately 5 minutes, just sat there, just breathed. After a while, Varric sat down next to me. We did not speak. We just sat there together in the noise and the light. Two people who had both decided to run towards something impossible and had come out the other side. The amber sky above the base deepened toward copper, then toward red. I thought about a name, the way a voice can carry a name, the way it sounds different when someone has decided, without explanation or ceremony, to stop sorting you into categories and say the specific word that is only yours. I thought about that for a long time. The armistice was announced on a Tuesday morning, not a victory, not a defeat. Cessation of active engagement while terms were discussed, which was a diplomatic way of saying that both sides had decided the cost of continuing was larger than the cost of pausing. Kraraf Dominion retained some of the outer mining positions they had seized. The coalition retained control of the relay corridors. Nobody got everything. Nobody got nothing. War, as it turns out, rarely ends in the way it begins. I found out about the armistice the same way most soldiers find out about things that change their lives, which is by someone else reading a message on a screen and reading it out loud to a room. In this case, it was Dara Cole, holding her data pad, sitting on the edge of her bunk, who said, "It's done," in a voice that was flat and matter of fact, and at the same time carried the weight of 8 months of fighting compressed into 2 words. The room was quiet for a Moment, then Owen Hatch said, "Does that mean we go home?" Dara said, "It means we find out what we found out over the next 3 days came through in pieces the way difficult news always does. First, the general armistice terms, then the coalition restructuring agreement, then, on the third day, the specific provisions regarding human forces. The Valoran High Command had included a clause. It was phrased in the careful, neutral language of official documents, but its meaning was direct. Human military units attached to the coalition joint forces were to be reassigned to non-combat advisory roles pending review of coalition structural requirements. The review process was estimated to take between 6 and 18 months. What this meant in plain language was that the Valiant Central Command wanted humans out of primary operations and were using the post-armistice restructuring to accomplish what the battlefield had not let them accomplish while the fighting was happening. We had been too useful to remove during a conflict. We were now no longer inconvenient to remove. 18 months in an advisory role meant 18 months of insignificance. It meant being present without being counted. It meant our record, the Eastern Ridge, the installation, the sensor network, the Northern Valley extraction, all of it being quietly set aside in a filing system designed to minimize rather than recognize. I read the provision 3 times, then I set my data pad down and walked outside and stood in the cold morning air of the base perimeter and looked at the sky. The sky on this planet was extraordinary in the mornings. It did a thing I had never seen on Earth, where the light came up from below the horizon a full 20 minutes before the actual sunrise and turned the entire dome of the sky a deep clear blue that faded at the edges to the palest possible color, almost white, and for those 20 minutes everything was lit from below, as though the planet itself was glowing. I stood in that light and thought about what to do. There was not, honestly, very much I could do. I was a corporal. The provision had been inserted by Valoran High Command, which was an authority so far above my level that the distance was not really measurable. I could file an objection through coalition channels, which would be politely logged and politely ignored. I could talk to the coalition liaison, who would express sympathy and explain that the restructuring agreement was binding. I could be angry about it in the quiet, ineffective way that people are angry about things that are outside their reach. None of those options were appealing. I was still standing there when Verk found me. He appeared beside me without preamble and stood there, looking at the same sky for a moment. Then he said, "You have heard about the provision?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The Surin delegation has filed a formal objection with the coalition board." I turned to look at him. He was watching the sky with the same calm expression he used for everything, but there was something in the set of his jaw that I recognized from the Northern Valley, from sitting beside me after the extraction, from the way he had said, "I'm coming with you," and meant it. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the provision is wrong and because we have records to show it. The sensor mission, the installation defense, the northern extraction." He paused. "The Eastern Ridge." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Varric." He said, "Do not thank me. We both know what the battlefield says. The objection is simply asking the record to speak." He left. Stayed. At 900 Dara Cole came to find me and said that the platoon had been informed of the provision and was asking what happened next. I said we wait and see. She looked at me with the expression she used when she thought I was being insufficiently direct. She said, "That's it." I said, "For now." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, "Owen thinks the commander is going to do something." I said, "Owen thinks a lot of things." She said, "Owen is often right." I went back inside at 1400 that same day. Valoran military delegation received a formal request for an emergency review of the human force provision before the restructuring agreement was finalized. The request came from Commander On. Telsura filed directly with the Valoran High Council under her authority as Senior Field Commander of the Joint Operation. I found out because Varric told me he came to the platoon quarters in the early afternoon and said simply, "She filed." I sat with that for a moment. She had filed with the High Council, not the Coalition Board, not the Joint Operations Committee, not some intermediate body that could absorb the objection and redirect it into a process designed to produce nothing. The High Council, the body that had issued the provision in the first place. I said, "What does that cost her?" Varric said, "Significant political standing." High Council does not respond well to challenges from field commanders. They view it as overreach. I said, "Does she know that?" Varric looked at me with an expression that said the answer was obvious. Of course she knew. She knew better than anyone. She was a princess of the Valoran Empire, born into its politics, trained in its hierarchies, shaped by its expectations from the first day of her life. She knew exactly what filing would cost her. She filed. Anyway, the hearing before the High Council took place the following morning. It was transmitted through the Coalition diplomatic channel, which meant that anyone on the joint base with access to the channel could observe it. I did not watch it in real time. I found out afterward from Dara, who had watched the entire thing on a tablet in the corner of the platoon quarters. She told me what happened. On had appeared before the council in full Valoran formal dress, the white armor of an active commander replaced by the formal garments of her rank, gray and silver and precise. She had stood before 7 council members, and she had presented without any visible emotion and in perfect order the combat record of the human platoon attached to the joint operation, the Eastern Ridge engagement. 47 minutes of sustained defense against a force 6 times our size. 0 position loss, a counter maneuver that relieved pressure on the main installation during a critical phase. The northern perimeter rescue, unauthorized movement to cover a command post under attack, direct action at close range, command post secured the sensor network mission, field modification that eliminated an open ground vulnerability attributed by the mission commander herself to human field assessment capability, data gathered that led directly to the disruption of 3 craft supply lines, the Northern Valley extraction, unauthorized deployment, no available alternative. Mission commander located and extracted from a 40-strong encirclement. Full platoon returned with no fatalities. She laid it out in the precise, economical language she used for everything, without flourish and without advocacy, simply asking the record to speak exactly as Varric had said. When she was done, one of the council members asked Commander Telsura, "You are aware that this challenge places your standing with this Counsel at risk, she said yes. Council member said, and you filed. Regardless, she said, I filed because the record is accurate and the provision is not consistent with it. Another council member said the provision concerns long-term strategic coalition structure, not individual unit performance. She said with respect, the individual unit performance is the relevant data for evaluating the provision's premise. The premise is that human military units are not suited to primary operational roles. The record indicates otherwise. If the premise is incorrect, the provision built on it requires review. Draw telling me this. Paused at that point, said she did not raise her voice once. 7 council members, and she spoke to all of them like she was reading coordinates. I said, what did they say? Draw said, they said they would take the objection under advisement. She paused again, but 2 of them asked follow-up questions. Real ones, not dismissive ones. Review was ongoing when the final restructuring documents were submitted for signature. The human force provision was tagged as under dispute in the final agreement, which meant it was formally included but not binding until the review concluded. It was not a victory. It was a door left open. That afternoon, I was told that Commander Antelsura was at the northern loading dock where units preparing for return transport were being staged. She was scheduled to depart for Valoran space in the evening. The coalition debriefing was complete. Her official role in the joint operation was concluded. I went to the loading dock. She was standing at the edge of the staging area, not looking at the transport ships but at the sky. She was in her formal garments rather than her armor, which made her look different in a way I could not entirely quantify. The same person but differently presented, like seeing a landscape in 2 different seasons. Her silver hair was in its braid again. I stopped a few meters away. She heard me. She looked over. We looked at each other for a moment without saying anything, which had become somehow a comfortable way to be with each other. The silences between us having shifted from awkward to simply present, the way silences are between people who have been through things together and no longer need to fill the space. I said, I heard what you did at the council. She said, the record speaks for itself. I said, you knew what it would cost you. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, yes. I said, why? She looked at me with an expression that was difficult to name. It was the most open I had ever seen her face, the most like a person rather than a commander, and it held something that I think was honesty in its purest form, the kind that does not calculate or protect itself, that simply says the true thing because the true thing is the only thing worth saying. She said, because you ran towards something impossible when no one ordered you to, because VAR treated the wounded without sorting them first, because Marsh stacked the stones in the dark without being asked, because Cole hauled hatchback into position under fire, because she decided she would not leave him there. She paused, because you are the most impractical and inconvenient soldiers I have ever encountered, and somehow the battlefield keeps going the way it should anyway. I said that might be the kindest thing anyone has ever said about us. She said it was not intended as kindness. I said, I know. That's why it is. The corner of her mouth moved. That same small thing I had first noticed in the valley in the copper light of the afternoon. I was certain of it this time. It was not almost a smile. It was a small and precise and entirely real. she looked at the sky again, the amber of the late afternoon was shifting toward the deep copper of early evening. She said the review will likely take 3 months. Possibly more, I said. Will be in advisory roles until then, unless the provision is overturned. She said it will be reviewed fairly. I made certain of that. I said, I know. Then she said, 3 months is not so long. I looked at her. She was still looking at the sky, but she was not looking at the sky the way she looked at tactical maps or terrain assessments. She was looking at it the way someone looks at a thing they are making a decision about. I said, no, it's not. She turned and looked at me. Her gray eyes were very clear in the evening light. She said, I have been in this operation for 8 months. In that time I have filed 1 emergency objection with the High Council. I said, I know. She said, I do not typically file objections. I said, I know. She said, I am aware that this is a significant departure from standard practice. I said, I know that too. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said very quietly, good, and that was it. No declaration, no ceremony, just that word in that voice in the copper light of evening on a planet far from anywhere either of us had started. 2 people on the edge of something that had no map and no precedent and no guarantee, I thought, standing there about what it takes for a thing to change, not the big announced changes, the armistices and agreements and provisions filed in formal language. The other kind, the kind where one person decides to look at another person as a person rather than as a category. The kind where someone runs when no one has ordered them to run. The kind where a word, just one word, just a name, carries a whole new meaning because of who says it and when and why. I had come to this planet as part of the species that had been in space for 60 years, ones with limited engagement history, the ones sorted neatly into a category called expendable. I was leaving something different, not a hero, not a symbol, just a person who had been seen finally clearly by someone who did not give that easily and did not take it back once given. She turned toward the transport. I said, safe journey. She paused. She did not turn around, but she paused, and her voice when it came was the quietest I had ever heard it. She said, when the review concludes. I said, I'll be here. She walked toward the transport. I watched her go, the braid of silver hair, the straight back, the precise and unhurried step of someone who has decided where she is going and is going there without doubt. The sky above the base was extraordinary that evening. It did the thing it did, the light rising from below the horizon, the whole dome going deep blue at the top and pale at the edges. It lasted for 20 minutes the way it always did, and then it passed and the stars came out, and they were numerous and bright and very, very far away. I stood there and looked at them for a long time. 11 months ago, I had been a corporal from a species nobody had heard of, shipped out to a war on behalf of a coalition that tolerated our presence the way you tolerate a door that swings in the wrong direction, useful in principle and inconvenient in practice. And now I was standing on the edge of a loading dock on an amber-skied planet, watching the stars come out, and somewhere in the transport that was lifting from the pad behind me, a Valoran commander who had once sorted me into the category of expendable was thinking about 3 months, the way I was thinking about 3 months, which is to say not as a long time but as exactly the right amount. Some things do not need to be said to be known. Some things are bigger than the species you were born into, or the war you were deployed to, or the 11,000 years of history that says two people from different worlds cannot simply decide to stand on the same ground. Some things you run toward without orders, some things you hold, the way 11 soldiers held a ridge that was designed to break them, not because it was efficient, not because it was calculated, not because it made sense on any map, because someone had to, because you decide to, because the most dangerous and most human thing I have ever done was not the fight on the eastern ridge, or the corridor at the northern perimeter, or the run through the valley. It was standing still long enough for her to look at me and decide I was worth seeing. That was the hardest thing in the